flight instructor at Leading Edge in Bend, Oregon for about the past 2.5 years. And then now I fly as a co-pilot on the Sky Crane doing firefighting contracts throughout the Southwest. So this presentation is going to be over commercial helicopter operations and then the regulations that apply to those operations. Throughout this discussion, we're going to talk about some of the privileges and limitations, the Part 119 and the exceptions that go with it, operational control, types of operating certificates, common carriage versus private carriage, wet versus dry lease, and then we'll have some scenarios at the end that go along with those. So let's just say, for the majority of this presentation, we're assuming that the student, this is kind of their first time experiencing this. They just passed their commercial check ride. So what does this allow them to do? So from 61-133, we can read that a person who holds a commercial pilot certificate may act as pilot in command of an aircraft for compensation or hire, or if they're carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. So that's great, right? We can get paid to fly now, but does that mean that we can buy a helicopter and start charging people to fly them around? Well, not quite. Before we get into the why we can't do that, we'll first go through and review some of the FAR parts. So we're all pretty familiar with Part 91, and that's just general operations. And so all civilian flights at a minimum must abide by those rules. And typically, Part 91 does not require an operating certificate, which then leads us into Part 119. And this is essentially our roadmap for when an operator certificate is required. And so this part will prescribe the different types that are issued by the FAA. And then there's a subpart E, that identifies operations that can be performed without having an operator certificate. Under Part 119, so if we get an operator certificate, then we have to abide by not only the Part 91 rules, but now the rules of whatever parts that we fall under, which could be 121, 125, or 135. Now for helicopters, 9 times out of 10, we're going to fall under that Part 135. Part 121 is typically going to be those scheduled air carriers, that'd be your airlines, high regulation, SMS plans, much more oversight on those. For Part 125, this is, you could read an airplane or powered lift having a seating capacity of 20 or more passengers or a maximum payload of 6,000 pounds or more. And so this will typically be your larger aircraft that are just doing private air charters, let's say for a group or a team. And they're less restrictive than a Part 121, and they cannot involve common carriage. So they're for a select group of companies or individuals. And the Part 135, which is what we typically fall under, is going to be for commuter or on-demand operations. So this will be non-scheduled or smaller scheduled commercial operations. There's higher regulation with this compared to Part 91. There will be an SMS that's required, a safety management system. And then there are some hour requirements for this too. And so typically requires pilots to have 500 hours total time for VFR operations or 1,200 hours for IFR operations. And there's some additional ones with that as well, cross country and some other things, but just generally those are some baselines. And then some additional FAR parts be Part 133, some external load operations, or 137, agriculture operations. So then we kind of go back to the question of, well, why can't we just buy a helicopter and start charging people to fly them around? So under Part 119.25, we look at rotorcraft operations. And so if we read this, each person who conducts rotorcraft operations for compensation or hire must comply with the certification and operation specification requirements of subpart C of this part, ... You can break this entire regulation down into all the different meanings of these parts. But ultimately what it means for us is if you have a helicopter and you fly for compensation or hire, you will at a minimum need a Part 135 operating certificate, unless it falls under those 119 exceptions that we talked about earlier, and we're going to talk about those more in depth coming up. So all that being said, we're still kind of left with the question, what are our options to fly and get paid? So there's kind of 2 routes that we can go with this. One of those is let's say that we either have our own helicopter or we're going to buy one. So we can either A, get a Part 135 operating certificate like we talked about, or that list of 119 exceptions. And so those exceptions are various flight activities that do not require an operating certificate, but they do, or they could require some additional certification or requirements, such as falling under 133 or 137, which we'll get into in a little bit. So that's one option, right? If we have our own aircraft or we're going to buy it. Option two is I'm a commercial pilot. Maybe I just want to use that certificate that I've earned, and I just want to go make money. So I could either go fly for someone who already has an operating certificate, or I could find someone who has a helicopter and wants me to fly them around in it. And so this falls under Part 91 because I'm not a commercial operator in this sense. I'm only providing me, the pilots, I'm not providing the aircraft. And so ultimately, I don't have operational control of this operation, which kind of leads us to what is operational control, because that's ultimately determining, in this scenario, whether we're a commercial operator. So operational control with respect to a flight means the exercise or authority over initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. And there's essentially kind of three basic areas that go into operational control: the air crew, the aircraft, and the flight management. And so while I am the PIC, if I decide to go fly for someone in their own aircraft and fly them around, operational control kind of comes down to who is responsible for aspects such as deciding who's flying, when it flies and where it goes, if there's any maintenance, where that maintenance occurs, airport fees, and anything really associated with that. Who decides those pieces? That's the person who has operational control. And if it's not me, then I'm not a commercial operator. I am just a pilot with a commercial pilot certificate, providing my services to whoever wants to pay for those. Now, we talked before about that operating certificate. So let's say that we want to go that route instead. I don't want to fly for someone else. I want my own aircraft. I want to make my own money. So I want an operating certificate. So there's essentially two types that we can get: either an air carrier certificate or just an operator certificate. And the main difference between the two is, for an air carrier certificate, I'm conducting interstate, foreign, or overseas transportation, or will carry mail. And so the part that matters for us is the interstate, which simply means that I'm just going over state lines, right? I'm not just flying in the states that I operate in. I'm going to go to different states, which typically is what you would be doing. You could also just get an operator certificate, and that would allow you to work intrastate, which would just be in that one state. Now, on that certificate, there's going to be an authorizing section, and that's going to say whether you're able to conduct either private or non-common carriage operations. The term's the same, they're used interchangeably. So either private carriage or common carriage operation. We're going to talk about that here in a second. But over here is a picture of an air carrier certificate, and on here, we can see that we are authorized to operate as an air carrier. So in this case, like we talked about, we're able to go beyond the state lines, and we're able to conduct common carriage operations. So we'll talk about that. In addition to, I'm saying that there's two types of these 135 certificates. There's also scope of these, which we're not going to get into because the purpose of this presentation isn't for you to be an expert in a Part 135. But there's additional aspects to it of whether your 135 is just for a single pilot, a single PIC with additional SICs. So just know that this isn't a full encompassing discussion on Part 135. There's a lot more to it. But anyways, back to the common carriage piece that we just talked about. So what is the difference between private carriage and common carriage? So we have this AC 120-12A, which ultimately provides the guidelines for determining whether a current or proposed transportation operation by air constitutes private or common carriage, right? So it tells us which one is which. So for common carriage, there's 4 elements. And even though we're talking about that now in the commercial side, this actually should really be taught, common carriage specifically, just this piece, whenever you're talking about private pilot operations, because it does apply there. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit on why it does apply. But here, common carriage, there's essentially 4 elements. So you're transporting persons or property from place to place for compensation and holding out. So let's kind of break that down. So transporting persons or property, pretty simple, right? People or property, from place to place. Now the compensation thing, a lot of people think that means that there has to be an exchange of money, right? The customer gives me dollars, I give them the service. But the FAA has tons of interpretation and literature talking about how it actually doesn't have to be, even for a profit, there doesn't even have to be money exchange, simply either an economic advantage or just a benefit. And that has even shown to be flight hours could be compensation. And then the fourth piece is that holding out or a willingness to serve all. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And then private carriage, which is again referred to as non-common carriage. It's essentially the same thing as common carriage, except we're just not holding out. So I'm still transporting persons or property, going from place to place. I'm doing it for compensation. I'm just not holding it out to everyone. And then with private carriage, it's typically for one or several selected customers, generally on a long-term basis. And we'll talk about that, why that is, because the number of contracts can't be too great. Otherwise, it implies that I'm going to make a contract with anyone. So what is holding out, well, or a willingness to, is accomplished by any means to communicate to the public that a transportation service is available to the members of the segment of the public that I'm designed to attract. So all this means is the public, I am just advertising to them in some way or letting them know that I have a service and I'm offering it to them. And this can be done in numerous ways, whether it's posting, an ad, whether it's putting up a sign, spreading around business cards. There's numerous ways that I could hold out and let the public know that I have a service. So when we go back to this, with common carriage, I do these three pieces and I hold out or I have a willingness to serve all. Because if I start serving everyone, then that would imply that I'm essentially doing it for anyone. And so this would be the same thing as holding out, even if I'm not directly doing it. So you might be wondering, why is this important? Why does common carriage versus private carriage, why does it matter? For the commercial side, when we go and talk about operating certificates, not all of them are going to be the same. And you can get an operator certificate that authorizes operations, like we saw before, either via private carriage or common carriage. So private carriage, an operator certificate that allows for private carriage, it's easier to get, but you're now limited to the number of contracts that you can fly for. Whereas with common carriage, it's much harder to get, takes longer to get, but now you can fly around for anyone. And so why is there even the difference between the two? The FAA views common carriage as presenting a higher public risk because essentially the public has no way to evaluate your maintenance, the training, procedures, or safety. Whereas if you're doing private carriage and you're going, just for a select few contracts or customers, they have that ability to evaluate your maintenance, your training, your procedures before they decide. Okay, so all of that aside, and we'll tie all this back again to later, because again, like I said before, we're kind of teaching this as if the student, it's their first time learning about these things, and so we'll kind of come back to them and tie it all again later. But we talked about part 119.1 exceptions, which basically was, I don't need an operating certificate if I'm doing any of these activities. And so this is just a screenshot that comes directly from there. There's a handful within this list. Student instruction, nonstop commercial air tours, farrier training flights. And so there's a bunch here, but you can't just read them at face value. So like we talked about before, you may need additional certification or other requirements in order to perform these. The first one would kind of outline that pretty simply, right? Student instruction. If I have a commercial pilot certificate, I can't just go teach students instruction, right? I would also need a CFI certificate with that. Same thing with nonstop commercial air tours. If you continue to read, there's limitations with there about the distance. Within 91-147, then you start to get into a drug and alcohol testing program, and same thing with 136. So there's just additional pieces with that. And so when we decide an operation that we want to perform and we look for an exception, we have to go deeper into there. Firefighting's on there, right? You can't just go and start doing firefighting, especially if it's, let's say, an external load, right? We talked about part 133 being external load, would also have to have a certificate for that. Now, next thing we're going to get into is the vanilla letter of interpretation. So we know now that I can perform one of these part 119 exceptions without an operating certificate. And one of these is actually aerial photography. And so there's no distance or mileage limit if I want to perform aerial photography. So I'm allowed to pick someone up, they can come with me, and we can fly basically a nonstop flight as long as they're doing aerial photography. But now, if they're doing that, what if we want to do something else with it? Another one of the exceptions that are in Part 119, can they do that? And so this letter of interpretation essentially outlines what you can and can't do. So when operations have a dual purpose, meaning, for example, that an operation is conducted for both, this is their example, pipeline patrol and transporting passengers for compensation or hire, then the exception would not apply to that operation. So the FAA has held that an aerial works flight that lands at a place other than where it departed would generally assume a dual purpose flight, right? Because if it's an aerial work flight, I'm doing that from the air, so I'm not landing anywhere. However, the FAA has also recognized an exception to the general rule for landings for aircraft or human needs. So landing for the purpose of aircraft refueling or human needs would not take the flight out of that aerial photography exception. So if the aircraft needs to be refueled, if your passengers need to use the restroom, you can land somewhere and allow them to do that, and it still keeps you within the 119 exception of aerial photography. But now you would be prohibited from picking up additional passengers or property, and no work such as a pipeline inspection, photography, or filming would be permitted while the aircraft's on the ground, right? Because again, this is an aerial work exception, and so anything on the ground would then make that a dual purpose flight, and it would get rid of your exception ability to make this operation without an operating certificate. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is a wet versus a dry lease. So sometimes aircraft owners might lease their aircraft to maximize the use of it and to recover some expenses. So the question is, does this fall under Part 91 or 135? So when I'm doing a dry lease, I provide just the aircraft, right? So let's say that it's my aircraft, I'm leasing it to someone else. I'm giving them the aircraft, and whoever's leasing it, they're going to independently supply the crew, and they retain operational control, right? So the only thing I'm doing is just giving them the aircraft. They take care of everything else. And all flights, under their purposes, they're not holding out, right? So that would just be a private operation. Now, a wet lease, on the other hand, is when I give both the aircraft and the crew, which means I would retain operational control, right? So we talked about that operational control before. Get back to it. And so if I'm providing both the aircraft and the flight crew, then I'm the one who's deciding the aircraft assignments. I'm deciding who is initiating or if I'm going to initiate or conduct or terminate a flight. I would be responsible for maintenance when that happens. Everything would be on me in that instance, so I would maintain operational control. So in that case, that would be a wet lease. And a wet lease cannot fall under Part 91 because I'm providing both the pilot and the aircraft. So that would be a 135 operation. And so you can see the example is the same one I just mentioned, right? Leases helicopters to multiple companies without a crew, which is dry lease, Part 91. As soon as I add that crew with it, becomes a wet lease, and that's a Part 135. So just went through a ton of information, and so now we'll get into some of the scenarios that go along with it. Okay, so your neighbors want to pay you to fly them to Portland so they can go drinking. Can you accept this flight under Part 91? That's the question. And I ask this one often, and it can become a little bit tricky in some instances. And so this actually is more of a private pilot operation question. So only if there was a common purpose, and I pay no less than my pro rata share, and I didn't hold out for the flight, only then can I do this under Part 91. And so this is exactly why I mentioned that common carriage kind of has to be taught during the private pilot rating, because this is a private pilot operation, or it can be, but I'm not allowed to hold out for this flight. There was before a website where private pilots could go on there and they could publish where they're going to be flying to, and then people could connect with them and say, yep, I'll go with you and I'll just pay my half. But the problem is there was no common purpose for that, right? Or there essentially becomes a common purpose, but I can't hold out for that. The common purpose piece comes down to, if you weren't paying, would I go? And so in this scenario of your neighbors want to pay you to fly them to Portland so they can go drinking, I wasn't planning on going to Portland to begin with. So if I take away the piece of them offering to pay their half, would I still be going? And I wouldn't. So there's no common purpose. So pretty simple on that one, right? I can do it under Part 91, but only if I was already planning to go there, only if I pay no less than my pro rata share, and only if I didn't hold out for that flight. The next scenario, your friend Jim has an R-44 that needs ferried from Idaho to Arizona for the winter. Can you accept this flight under Part 91? And for this one, yes, absolutely. And I can do this both for free, just, for the heck of it, but I could also do it and be paid for it. And even if I was doing it for free, that would still be considered compensation, though, right? Because we talked earlier, any kind of benefit, economic benefit. And in this case, those free flight hours that I would be getting, that is the benefit. But since I'm a commercial pilot and I'm only providing my piloting services, right, the aircraft's not mine, I don't have operational control, that's a legal flight under Part 91. Okay, next scenario. REI has a private helicopter and wants you to fly their employees around for business purposes. Can I accept this job and fly under Part 91? And the answer for this one is yes. So REI has operational control. Same thing we talked about with operational control before. They're in charge of all of that. I am just the pilot. And the flight is incidental to the business. So one piece we're not really going to get into today, because it kind of becomes a longer discussion, is about an illegal flight department. And essentially that is where a business buys an aircraft, or let's say an LLC, they buy an aircraft, and their whole purpose is just transporting people. But they're trying to do it under the guise of Part 91 by saying it's incidental to their business. But if we look at the definition of a commercial operator in 1.1, where it is doubtful whether an operation is for compensation or hire, the test applied is whether the carriage by air is merely incidental to the person's other business or is in itself a major enterprise for profit. So in this scenario, if we took away the fact that I'm flying around the employees, REI is still making money. They still have their primary principal business. This flight that I'm doing and moving their employees is only incidental to that. It's only assisting, but it's not the primary piece to that. So it's legal and it's all under Part 91. Okay, next scenario. A real estate agent has a prospective buyer wanting to see and take photos of a property from the air. Can you accept this flight under Part 91? And absolutely. So this falls under the Part 119.1 exception for aerial photography. But now the buyers ask if you can land in the yard so they can walk the property. Can we do this? And no, like we talked about before, that becomes dual purpose. Okay, next one is a fire lookout tower on the outskirts of town is scheduled to be repaired. Construction supplies are needed to be transported. Can we accept this flight under Part 91? And for this one, the answer would be no, because if we go back to those exceptions about transportation, let's see if we can get back to it. Here we go. If we go to aerial work operations, we can see that rotorcraft operations in construction or repair work. But Part 119 of this chapter does apply to transportation to and from the site of operations. So we can do construction or repair work under Part 119, the exception, but as soon as we're doing transportation to or from the site, that then becomes a commercial operation that we require an operating certificate for. Okay, next scenario, an underwater power line receives an annual LiDAR inspection. Can you accept this flight under Part 91? And the answer for this one is yes, but we must meet the equipment requirements of 91.205 B12, which states if the aircraft is operated for hire over water and beyond power off gliding distance from shore, approved flotation gear readily available to each occupant, and unless the aircraft is operating under Part 121 of the subchapter, at least one pyrotechnic signaling device. So I need approved flotation gear, so a life preserver for each occupant, and a pyrotechnic signaling device. So it'd be like a flare. Okay, so some frequently asked questions. Is compensation just receiving money? And we kind of already talked about and alluded to that earlier, that no, it is the receipt of anything of value that is contingent upon the pilot acting as PIC of an aircraft, which again can include even flying for free flight hours. Now, wouldn't that mean that the expense sharing that we were allowed to do as a private pilot, wouldn't that be compensation, right? The pro rata share that they're offering, right? Because that'd be money. Wouldn't that then be compensation that would require an operating certificate? And the answer for that one is no. Absent a bona fide common purpose, so a legitimate common purpose for their travel, reimbursement for the pro rata share of operating expenses constitutes compensation, and the flights would be considered a commercial operation. So there has to be, like we talked about earlier, that legitimate common purpose for the travel. So long as that's there, then it's not compensation. But if we remove that common purpose, then that becomes compensation, and we would require an operating certificate. So in summary, when do we need an operating certificate? Anytime we're receiving compensation when flying our own helicopter, unless it's a Part 119.1 exception. So again, our own helicopter, I'm providing not only my services, but the aircraft as well. What is the difference between common carriage and private carriage? Well, they're different authorizations on an operating certificate. One that will allow me to advertise to the public and fly anyone, and one that will allow me to fly for a select number of contracts. What's the difference between a wet lease and a dry lease? Wet lease, I'm providing just the aircraft, whereas a person who is leasing, they're independently supplying the crew and they retain operational control. Whereas on a wet lease, I'm providing both the aircraft and crew, and I retain the operational control. So what if the flight operation I want to conduct under Part 91 isn't explicitly in a Part 119 exception, but it's kind of similar to one? Well, that's not an all-inclusive list that they have there. So something you can do is search for previously issued letters of interpretation and see if there's one that's been asked before. Oftentimes there are. Or you could call your local FSDO and check with them, which is often the safe answer. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do is just talk about a court case to kind of tie together the importance of determining whether the operation needs an operating certificate or if it doesn't. So this is Gorman versus the NTSB. And in 2003, Michael Gorman obtained a Part 135 operating certificate to fly his business flying cargo in the form of bank checks for a single bank. So he went through all the work and got the Part 135 operating certificate. But then 2 years later, he decided he actually didn't need it to operate his business, right? Because it's kind of a lot of upkeep, cost, and there's much higher requirements. And so he obtained a written opinion from an aviation attorney with the last name of Grissom. And that attorney said that as a private carrier, Gorman didn't need the certificate, the Part 135. He believed that it's only required for common carriers, which in this case he didn't think he was. Gorman's private carriage, the attorney believed, may be conducted under the rules of Part 91. And so the attorney sent a copy of the opinion letter to the FAA Regional Counsel for the Western Pacific region, who responded that the opinion accurately reflects the current state of the FAA's regulations, the advisory 120-12A that we saw earlier, and the policy on the issue of private carriage. So everything seems good, right? He got a 135, then decided he didn't need it. He went to his aviation attorney and he got a letter saying that he didn't, and they confirmed that with the FAA Regional Counsel. So everything should be good. A few years later, so that was in 2005. In 2007, while on a routine surveillance of the Long Beach, California airport, two aviation FAA safety inspectors observed an airplane displaying charter advertising on the side of the fuselage. When questioned by one of the inspectors, Gorman, the pilot, responded that he did not need an air carrier certificate to operate his business. In a subsequent telephone conversation, the other inspector told Gorman that he might be in violation of Part 119.23 if he was transporting bank checks for hire without an air carrier certificate. So we talked earlier about that 119.25, which was for helicopters. Part 119.23, simply just for airplanes. And so the pilot, he insisted that that doesn't apply to him because he was in private carriage, and that he had legal opinions from Grissom, the aviation attorney, and the counsel supporting his position. And again, private carriage was that he is carrying people or property, in this case it was bank checks, so property, from place to place for compensation or hire, and private carriage means he's not holding out, right? Not holding out. When contacted by the inspectors, Bolton opinion that indeed Mr. Gorman would need an air carrier certificate if he was transporting for hire in private carriage. So the inspectors contacted the FAA Regional Counsel, Bolton, and even though Bolton earlier said that his assertion of not needing an operating certificate was correct. Now he is saying that Gorman actually would need the air carrier certificate if he's transporting for hire in private carriage. On May 21st, 2007, Balton drafted a memorandum addressing certification requirements for private carriage by a small airplane operator. And in it, he stated that Advisory Circular 120-12A, which he cited in his earlier opinion, had not been revised since 1986 and therefore did not take into account FAR Part 119, which was issued and became effective later in time and therefore better represents the FAA's position with respect to private carriage. So while the Advisory Circular 120-12A made it seem like he didn't need an operating certificate and that he could perform private carriage under Part 91, that was far before Part 119 came out. And so the FAA believes that now the FAA's position with respect to private carriage, you would need an operating certificate. The 119.23 Bravo quoted in the memo noted that the AC is regulatory in nature, that regulation is regulatory in nature and must be complied with, while the advisory circular is advisory only. And it's simply a suggested means of complying with regulation. It is not regulatory and not enforced by the FAA. So you can't use the advisory circular as your sole justification for performing an operation. It's simply just a means to help you comply with it. Following this exchange, Gorman continued to operate his private carriage business as before. And on August 27th, 2007, the FAA served an emergency order revoking Gorman's commercial pilot certificate because he was advised by the FAA that his operation was in violation of the FARs on at least 20 occasions, but he continued those operations in deliberate disregard of the notification from the FAA, and as such was in violation of the FARs, in particular FAR 119.23. So all of this to say that if an operation does not fall under Part 119, one of the exceptions, and you are receiving compensation or hire, you do have to have an operating certificate. And then whether you're performing common carriage, private carriage, then that goes on to the operating certificate itself. And that is essentially commercial operations in a nutshell. Now, there's a lot of pieces that we didn't fully cover, one of those being the illegal flight departments. But hopefully that at least gives a baseline for some of the operations. And it's hopefully much more cut and dry than it actually seems. But within each of those exceptions, and those can go down some rabbit holes. Questions?
Outstanding. A complex and difficult subject that you help break down and make more retainable. Really helpful. I have a question.
Chat, see if any questions in there.
Can you hear me?
John, any questions?
Yes, you can't hear me, it sounds like. So I'm going to throw something in the chat to see if you can. Check the chat. It doesn't appear you can hear me, Clay. Can you yet? I'm talking to you, buddy.
Not seeing anything from John. It's just loading on his end.
John has a question.
You can hear me. Nope, John, we cannot, or at least I cannot hear you.
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you, John, but
okay.
Can Clay hear me?
I don't think Clay can hear anyone.
There we go.
Oh.
I put it in there. Everyone can hear me but Clay.
Oh, everyone can hear him except for me.
Yeah.
Oh. Let me refresh mine.
Yeah. See how he...
Okay.
Can you hear me, brother? Not yet? Still nothing? We're talking. We're talking here.
Still nothing on my end. Interesting.
It is interesting. What could it be? What could it be? Anybody have any suggestions?
Hopefully you were able to hear me through that presentation.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't just talk for 40 minutes.
We heard you.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. You could hear me. Awesome.
Like to talk with you, though.
Soundboard.
See if there's anything I can do.
I'll refresh it again.
Anybody have any suggestions?
Okay, I'm going to try to figure out why
Okay.
that's not working on mine, but feel free to discuss commercial
Yeah.
operations in the meantime.
It's probably his settings of which speakers are putting it out.
Okay. I know he had two devices too. Okay, well, while he's figuring that out, I had the misconception that if an operation fails to meet one of the four elements of common carriage, then it defaults to a 91 operation, and that it becomes private carriage. And I realize that that's not the case. And I think the key component is the holding out component. Does that seem right? If you're doing his last case study was a really good example of the operator doing all three things, with the exception of the advertising on the side of the plane. Can you hear us, Clay? Not yet. Still can't hear us. So any thoughts on that, you guys? Those falling under the four. Good.
I feel the wording that the FAA chose for private carriage is not great, because I feel that they're trying, like, what is to be understood is, it's private carriage, doesn't require an operational certificate, but private carriage does require an operational certificate. You're just not holding out. So not holding out sets you back to private carriage, but it still requires an operational certificate. So my question also was towards that first scenario, if someone wants to hire you to go fly to Portland, right? But they have operational control. If they have operational control and they are providing the aircraft, and they just saw you weren't holding out. You weren't saying, "Hey, I am taking people from Bend to Portland," right? You weren't saying anything. He has an aircraft and he comes to you because he saw that you're a pilot. It's not a bad thing to say you're a pilot. That's not holding out. You're just saying, "Hey, I've got my license." So if he comes to you and says, "Hey, I've got this aircraft, right? And can I hire you to take me to drink some beers, as long as I rest my 8 hours and I'm not hungover, for the next day on the flight back, I can still get paid for doing that." Would that be?
Yeah, exactly. Because in that case, the only thing you're providing is just your piloting services. And so you could hold that one out all day long, right? Because you're not a commercial operator. You're not providing the aircraft and your services. You're just providing your services. So in that case, you are holding out, and you should, right? Because you want to be able to get work in that case. So hopefully he's hiring you and everyone else is hiring you too in that case. The only time an operating certificate would be needed in that case is if, let's say that not only are you taking that owner of the aircraft around, but if you start taking around other people who then start paying for that operation. So let's say that the owner of that aircraft says, "Hey, my friends also want to go to Portland too." And so you take them to Portland, and afterwards they give you some money for the flight. That then starts becoming a commercial operation, right? Prior to that, you could take anyone anywhere for that owner as much as you want. It's just a Part 91 operation. You're just providing services. But then as soon as additional money starts changing hands, that's when you may need that additional operating certificate.
Nice. And then, so back to the REI scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a business and the operator, he's not getting money from it. But if he were to start taking other people that are paying him, then that would be private carriage.
So that one depends. So there's another regulation, I believe it's 91-501, which involves fractional shares, and it also involves larger aircraft and things. Under that regulation, there is, I want to call it an exception, but you are allowed to reimburse for certain aspects of the flight. That typically does not involve helicopters, but there is an exception. It's the NBAA small aircraft exception that does allow helicopters to be part of that. and you can be reimbursed for some of that. So if you meet those requirements, I believe it's 91,501. Yep, 91,501. And under there, the following may be charged as expenses of a specific flight for transportation as authorized by paragraphs B3, 7, C1 of the section. Fuel, oil, and lubricants, travel expenses of the crew, including food, lodging, and ground transportation, hangar and tie-down costs, insurance, landing fees. There's a multitude of things within that they can. So if you abide by that 91,501, then they would be allowed to, REI could be reimbursed for some of those flights. If they don't fall under 91,501, then they can't. They can't at all. No, because even though it's incidental to the business, as soon as they start receiving an economic benefit from that, now they're transporting people for compensation, and they can't do that without an operating certificate.
Tricky.
Tricky indeed.
Awesome explanations, though. Thank you for setting everything out very structured and awesome presentation.
There's so much to it that it's kind of hard to get it in a specific flow that that makes sense. But I was hoping to go from the very beginning of each question you would ask along the way until you get to the very end. But any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to comment that what is commonly a confusing subject, I think you put into really good perspective, and it helped wrap our heads around some of that. So well done. Certainly a great presentation. I have a question that I proposed when you were deaf.
Yeah.
And I would like to get some clarification on it. I was under the impression, and it wasn't just me, in fact, I kind of learned, we discussed this at length with some of my earlier instructors, but we were under the impression that if an operation fails to meet one of the 4 elements of common carriage, then it would then default to Part 91 operations, or does it just become private carriage? And I think you answered that question in your LOL or your LOA or LOI at the end. Is that right? So if he didn't have that, he had carrier operations painted on the side of his airplane, would he have then fallen under Part 91, private carriage?
Oh, he did have the advertising, so
Yes.
at that point he was holding out,
Right.
painted across the side.
Right.
But let's say that we took that away.
Yes.
So he's still carrying people or property
Right.
from place to place
Right.
for compensation or hire. So the question would be is there anywhere within the Part 119 exceptions that would be allowed?
Right. So no.
And in that case,
Okay.
there wouldn't be, because even though he was doing mail, one of the exceptions is emergency mail services there's a
Yes.
specific regulation piece to that, which
Yeah.
he's not under that. So in that case, he's doing all the pieces of, because again, kind of the basis is, are you receiving compensation?
Right.
That's kind of the ultimate of this whole thing. Because even though the expense sharing is allowed under Part 91, that's not true compensation, right? Because it's only the pro rata, right? Like we talked about.
Yes.
In this case, he's receiving compensation. So the only question is it under an exception, which it's not.
Right.
So then is it an operating cert that he would need an air carrier or operating certificate? And then of those two, would it be private or common carriage? And
Got it.
in that case, he's going across state lines, so it would be an air carrier certificate, and he's advertising on the side, so he would need an authorization saying that he's able to perform these in common carriage.
That makes it much simpler. Just it's a little more cut and dry if you explain it that way. So he should have stuck with his 135.
Should have stuck with the 135.
Yeah.
Yeah, he would have been just fine.
Right.
Yeah. I think so much of the misunderstanding from this entire thing just comes back to that AEC 120-12A.
Yeah.
That's where most of that misunderstanding is, because in there it does talk about contracts, and that if you have less than 3 contracts, that
Yeah.
it can be performed under Part 91. But it's talking about subpart K, which is those fractional ownerships. It's talking about that other piece. It's not, you can't apply that to everything across the board, especially with holding out. People see the common carriage, and one of the pieces is being holding out, and they say, well, does that mean that if I become a commercial pilot, I can't hold out at all without an operating certificate? That's only talking about that specific piece of those two different certificates. But I've got to be able to hold out if I'm going to have a business, right? Imagine if you were trying to do one of these exceptions of a flight school and you didn't hold out. How would anyone know, right? Because even if you don't say advertise, and your student tells another student about this great flight school, at that point you have a willingness to serve all, so you're holding out anyways, right? You can't just use the broad stroke of applying that AC to every other operation or every other regulation across the board. They're very specific to what they're talking about.
Yeah, really good. Really good. I appreciate the breakdown on that. This is certainly more in depth than we originally went, and more clear. Because before we still had a lot of questions. But I think you're really helping narrow this down. It's either 135 or it's the 119 exemptions. Pretty much,
Those
right?
pretty much options.
Yeah. And then a million ways in between all of that.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, especially with those exceptions, because there's just so many different, and that's why some of the scenarios, especially the one for the overwater LiDAR, right? That one's not just as cut dry of, it's a survey, and so I'm allowed to do it, but there's also those other little pieces in the regulations of if I'm over, or beyond gliding distance from shore, now I also need these extra couple pieces. And so that really also pertains to those tours in there as well, of needing the drug and alcohol testing program or abiding by the other parts within 136. Because you'll take one regulation and then it's going to lead you to another, and then that regulation is going to lead you to another. So ultimately, if you're, and this doesn't apply, I feel like, to most students that come through the program, right? Because they're just going to get the ratings, they're going to go work for someone. And that someone's going to take care of all of this legality. But it's whenever you get the oddballs that either want to have their own helicopter in business, or they go work for a smaller operator somewhere out, and they try to then make more money by expanding their operation, but they don't do it legally. And so, to me, most of the goal of this presentation is for students not to become experts in Part 119 or 135, but to really just be able to know when to ask a question of, is this legal? Or more to this that we need to abide by than just saying that we're under Part 91 and that we're legal to do it. So,
Hey, Clay, how much time have you got? I got 5 or 6 questions.
as much as you want.
Awesome presentation. Great scenarios, and you have those little side quests that we have to cover of those additional regulations and considerations. Man, a really great job. The Gorman case makes me feel a lot better about things. He talked about referencing the AC 120, and that hadn't been updated since 1986, which makes me feel better for not getting the maneuver guide done. I've been working on for the last 5 years. Like, just
plenty of time.
Regulations are one thing, but we'll get there. We'll get to the documentation. I guess one of the first ones I want to talk about was the scenario of the Portland scenario. Nice picture, by the way, up in the Portland helipad in front of the buildings.
Before it got closed down.
And you talk, is it closed down? They're not doing it anymore?
Temporarily closed because, from what I heard, the fire suppression system didn't meet the regulation. I haven't checked the NOTAM since, but this was at least a couple months ago. That at the time it was closed down, so I'd have to double check.
It's an awesome flight into downtown Portland, landing on that helipad. So that scenario was you got the whole friends wanted to go fly up to Portland and everything, and you said you couldn't hold out for that, and it kind of cycles back to, I remember that maybe a few years back there were these, as you said, these websites where people were saying, hey, I happen to be going to Portland, would you like to fly with me? Right? And the FAA shut those down. But what about if I'm not planning on going to Portland, and a friend says, hey, I'm thinking about going to Portland to go drinking. Would you be interested in flying us up there?
Yeah.
I'd suggest that that's reasonable, and I would say, well, it wasn't my intention, but I'm into it. And so it's kind of like this fine line between advertising I'm going anyway versus someone sort of suggesting, and you say, well, that seems like a good idea.
Yeah, but the problem on that one is that there's no bona fide common purpose, because you still have to take the piece of take away, would I have went there if they didn't offer? And in that particular scenario, I wouldn't have. I wasn't planning on going to Portland anyway.
I guess that's what my question is, because isn't everything up for someone to suggest an idea and then you might go along with it? It doesn't. it's a difference between advertising on a website, I'm going there anyway, versus a friend say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Would you be interested in us flying there? I'd be like, yeah, I want to go grab Venus for the weekend at Portland.
Yeah.
So that's a tricky one, because
Yeah.
when
so-
does it become a common purpose? So what's the seed of the common purpose, you know?
Yeah, so that comes from the letter of interpretation, but I think the problem is if let's say that you were allowed to do that, where does it end? Because if let's say that person says, hey, I want to go there and do this, and they tell their friend, and that friend comes to me and says, well, hey, I want to go to Los Angeles and I want to go there. How about you fly us? And well, for me, that sounds like a great idea. And then at that point, you're essentially transporting people from place to place, and the compensation is in that case, there's no bona fide common purpose. And
But I disagree, because if I want to have a drink and I think like that's a good idea. Let's say that we're not flying anymore, it's just driving. And a friend says, hey, we're thinking about going to LA this weekend for a crazy weekend, and there's some comedy clubs and everything else. And I say, that's awesome, I'm into that. And we go drive. What's the difference when someone says, I'm into that, let's rent a helicopter, I'm a pilot?
yeah,
Well, if I might, the thought that I'm having, if I might interject in, the thought that I'm having is, if this is happening over and over, if you were going to originally go to Los Angeles or go to, Portland or whatever, that would mean that you would be the one willing to put up the money for your pro rata share. But now, if they're then doing that, then you're like, oh, I'll just put the cost on them. The FAA is probably going to look at that and say, like, well, here you're literally unloading the cost on them for something that you were going to pay for yourself. So that's probably what I would think of, like, where that probably would be more of a trend issue.
If it's more of a trend, it might be a drinking problem. It might be more than just regulations. But it might
Yeah,
depend.
that's true.
It might depend on whether you're the guy that's initiating and saying, "Hey, I'm going here. I need to round people up to cut costs," or whether you're like just looking to build hours and every opportunity to like, "Oh, I want to go there. Sure, I want to go there." But really, it's more about that's. I think that's a tricky one for the FAA to police, to be honest. If you know the people and you're friends with them and you want to go there because they suggested it, I'm skeptical about whether that being a problem.
AC 61-142. So it talks about the common purpose, and for under general it says, as previously stated, the FAA is consistently interpreted 61-113 to mean that a private pilot have a common purpose with his or her passengers and have his or her own reason other than the receipt of compensation for the flight for traveling to the destination. The existence of a bona fide common purpose is determined on a case-by-case basis depending on the facts and circumstances of each individual case. So in assessing whether a pilot is operating consistently with the expense sharing provision, the FAA considers whether the pilot has his or her own reason for traveling to the destination. When the pilot, not the passenger, chooses the destination, it suggests that the pilot is not simply transporting passengers for compensation. The common destination satisfies the common purpose test, even if the pilot and the passengers had different business to conduct at the destination.
Yeah, so that suggests that, even if I didn't want to go drinking with them, if I was going to go to Portland anyway, that's
exactly. Yeah, so the common purpose test can be stated as, but for the receipt of the compensation, the pilot would not have taken that flight. So, yeah, I go off
if someone suggests to me, hey, we're going to go to Portland and we're going to have some drinks, and I say, that's a great idea, I want to come. Hey, wait a second, let's take my helicopter. Or let's go in a helicopter, I'll fly us. To me, that still is, the pilot has its own reason. My reason is I want to go drink with my buddies. That's kind of where I'm thinking that would be acceptable.
Now it matters.
Well, I guess it's kind of which comes first, the chicken or the egg, which came first, them wanting to go to Portland or me also having that reason. I think that's a fair question.
But for the record, play the egg came first. It's official.
It's official. We're talking about compensation too here. So if they're paying you to do it, as opposed to you're splitting it, the pro rata, then at what point, if you're pro rata the expense, then it's a non-issue.
So there's also an example for flights with and without a common purpose. And so this example, a friend asks a pilot to fly him to another city to pick up a new car he ordered and offers to share the expenses of the flight. The private pilot agrees as he is not doing anything else and would enjoy the flight. As the passenger chose the destination and the private pilot does not have a purpose of his own to be in the other city at that time, this is an example of a situation where no common purpose exists. Let me see if there's another
So then
one.
the compensation would be considered flight time.
Yes.
Got it.
Wait, you had a slide just before the fire lookout that was about dual purpose, I think. Are you able to share that?
Absolutely.
Are you just looking up these examples from your slides?
Let's see.
Got it.
The one you were talking about, the real estate agent?
Yeah, just reveal the whole. Okay, so let me see. So the real estate agent. So one second. Okay, so I thought that the reason that they could not land, it's not really because it's dual purpose, it's because it doesn't meet the exception of aerial photography.
So it could be.
Because you could
if
have,
they could-
my suggestion is that perhaps you could have two exceptions. I can't think of them off the top of my head. That
Yes, that was the
it's
goal. They could land to the yard. Regardless of if there was another exception, it would still be dual purpose. There is also the exception of if the FSDO is notified and they get the FSDO is notified within 72 hours. So they could potentially ask for that. But if the aerial photography piece isn't included, then that would be dual purpose. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Change this particular scenario to include another one that's explicitly.
No, yeah, because in my understanding of it is if it's not aerial photography and you land and they get out, well, absolutely not, because that's not aerial photography. You don't need to go into it being dual purpose. And I can't think off the top of my head of a dual purpose where you could have two exceptions, which by themselves are acceptable, that are suddenly not acceptable if you combine them. I'm not even sure that that's completely the intention of the regulations. I guess, for example, if I was employed to tow a banner, and by the way, I want you to fly towards the birds, keep the birds away from the crops at the same time. Well, technically, that's actually two different of the 119
Yeah.
exceptions. I doubt that that's going to be a problem.
So under the vanilla letter, so he wanted to do pipeline patrol, which
I know that letter. But what I'm getting at is, I think that when they're talking about dual purpose, they're not complaining that you're doing two 119 exceptions. I think they're saying this is an exception, and you're trying to do something else that is not. They say use the word dual purpose, but I think that their beef with that is that you're trying to do something that, because if I remember right, the dual purpose in that letter interpretation, the second thing was not part of the exceptions at all. It was you're letting people get out and go to work. Is that the one?
Right.
I think that's their beef. It's not. They're just saying it's dual purpose, as in it is a 119 exception, and you're trying to do something else as well, which is not a 119 exception, and you can't try and cover it up by saying, "No, it's a 119 exception," but I'm letting this guy get out and go to work.
Yeah, no. I definitely see what you're saying. Let me pull up the letter and see if there's any more to it.
So do you think that under this, doing two that are both in 119.1e under those exceptions would not be dual purpose?
I don't think you'd have a problem with it because you just say, okay, this mission's ended, this one starts. If they're both under the exception, hey, we're doing banner towing, and or I don't know. I just feel like that's not the emphasis of what that letter was about. It kind of reminds me, Clay. You probably know this. I think you probably heard this scenario at the flight school. Is you have a request for a contract. We're gonna go do aerial photography down the coast, and you pick this person up in Newport, and you fly down the coast, and you take photos, and they're taking photos of whales or whatever they're doing, and then you land, and they do a P stop. You get some fuel, and as Clay already said, that's acceptable. Then you take off again, and you get all the way down to the California coast, and because it's aerial photography, you're supposed to come back to where you started, right? Because you're not supposed to transport this person, and this person says, "Oh, actually, you know what? I don't feel so good. I'm going to stay here." What do you do with that? Well, you're not going to force this person. You're not a medevac helicopter. You're not going to throw this guy in the back of the helicopter just because it doesn't meet the regulations. The intention of the regulation was not the purpose of the flight, of course, right? But it kind of makes me think about the same thing about the intention of following the regulations was to do aerial photography. And there's sometimes exceptions, but did we follow the intention of the regulation?
Right.
I think at least on that one for sure, I'd still, if they're feeling sick, I'd put that under a human need. So I think they're good regardless. I wouldn't force them back. But yeah, as far as whether or not you're allowed to do two, let me read into it.
So
any other questions that you had on that?
Yeah, so that one with the real estate agent. So we're still in agreement. We're still under the impression that it would not be compliant to stop at the location, land in the yard, get out. What if they're still taking photos?
No. Couldn't do that because again, it's an aerial work operation. So as soon as they're on the ground, yeah, they couldn't do that. Unless it was one of the other exceptions within 119, because there is the one that does allow if there's no more than two people carried, cargo is not carried, and the FSDO is notified that they can perform that.
That's 72 hour, yeah.
Yeah.
72 hours.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that is to do with management of the contractor or the clients. You say, hey, this is an aerial photography shoot. Just to let you know, I can't land and let you get out and start taking photos per regulations. That's part of trying to protect yourself from having to have that awkward conversation with your paying customer.
Right. Yeah, nobody would get that. They're like, what are you talking about? Why? It's a helicopter.
I know. What was the one about the fire lookout scenario? What was that one? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can pull that one back up. Using that terminology of the dual purpose, I pulled that directly from this letter of interpretation because that's what they say.
That. Yeah.
But I think that's a good thing to look into the two different exceptions. But let me share the screen for this one.
What's that letter of interpretation?
It's a Bonilla. So if you type in Ray Bonilla letter of interpretation, it'll pop up. There's no additional number on it, but it's dated September 7th of. It's kind of smudged, but 2011. 2011, yeah, it looks like 2011.
Yeah. Okay.
Got it.
I just put it in the chat as well.
Great.
Cool. And then just real quick here, we can keep going on that, but you had said that you were recording this. Are you posting this in the Facebook page, or are you just retaining that recording for yourself?
Yeah.
Because I would love to just go over the things that we talked about today.
Yeah, it'll be public. I post it on YouTube, and then on my personal YouTube, and then I repost it to the Discord and the Facebook. It'll be available.
Okay.
It's public.
What's your YouTube?
I believe it's just me, my name, John E. LeDrew, I believe, or John R. LeDrew. Or Johnny Eldorado? Don't know. Let me find out. My YouTube channel. Johnny Eldorado.
Hey, thanks for sharing that, Clay. I just didn't see it. It kind of moved through pretty quick, but yeah, I agree with that. That seems reasonable. My other last question really is the incidental thing. So you talked about if it's incidental, and you gave some examples. What about if I buy an R-44 and I start a flight school? My job is to train people, and then someone asks if I can fly them from A to B. How does that fit with the incidental part of it? Because my job is to do a flight school thing.
Flight school. Okay. Are they a paying customer?
Yeah, they're going to pay me to do this.
Gonna pay you to do it? Yeah, so that wouldn't be incidental to the business then, because you're receiving an economic advantage from that. So incidental, unless you fall under that 91501 exception of being able to reimburse for that list, if it's beyond that, then you're performing air transportation at that point.
So what's the definition of incidental as far as these regulations go, do you think?
Yeah, I can pull that up real quick.
We often talk about the great scenarios. I have a business where I'm a realtor and I'm going to sell houses, but I happen to own a helicopter, and I have this couple that really want to buy this ranch or whatever. Hey guys, come fly with me, and I'll fly you around the ranch, and hopefully that'll help sell the. But the difference there, of course, is they're not paying you. But as soon as they pay you, does that not become incidental? I always found it interesting that they didn't really define, as far as I know, they didn't define when the incidental line is crossed.
Okay, so I think I've got the answer for this one. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, so this is a really good document that I found of talking about flight department company traps. And so this was one of the ones that I mentioned that we don't get in, or I didn't get into very much today. But it'll talk about what's wrong with the flight department company, that they're trying to operate under 91 instead of 135. Let me find it. I guess I believe they talk about that exact thing that you're mentioning.
I mean, part of me would say, well, shit, it comes under the 119 exception for aerial survey, so it's a non-event, but
I imagine the MBAA is pretty. They're extremely compliant, or at least working on it. They must have a whole teams working on this with the FAA.
yeah, I'm sure they've lawyered up pretty good.
Yeah.
But I mean, part of me would say, well, they could even pay me because it's aerial survey. It wouldn't matter because it's aerial work. I would probably push it under that. In this scenario, I'd probably just push that under aerial survey exception, and we don't need a certificate for that. But I'm interested in where the incidental line crosses the line.
We'd have to dig into this, but I'm pretty sure they talk about that exact scenario in here.
While you're digging into that, Clay, I'm gonna share my screen. I want to show you guys something. Sound good?
There we go.
Did you find it?
I turned off my screen sharing so you can throw yours up.
Cool. I want to show you guys this flow chart. This, I think, helps break things down. We can run one of those scenarios here. And if we want to go through, just kind of pick a scenario, say the photo flights, for example. Is it for compensation or hire? And we just essentially follow it. No, then it's going to fall under Part 91. Yes, are we carrying persons or property from place to place? No, then we would need a 119 exemption. We know that. Yes, are we holding out? And I think that's one of those critical elements, is that holding outside. So operational control, wet and dry. This the less than 20 and payload of less than 6,000 pounds, that falls under, I believe, the 125. Was that right? Yes. So that wouldn't necessarily apply to us. Is operational control? Yes, it's a Part 135. It's our helicopter rating, or the helicopter kind of moment. We are holding out. Is there operational control? Yes. Is it scheduled Part 121, or it wouldn't apply to us and be Part 135? So I like the way this flow chart works. We can kind of run scenarios and just kind of step through it. I'd be happy to share this if anybody wants it.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Yeah. Feel free to jump back on, Clay, if you have answers to that, the incidentals portion.
Hey, just while we're waiting for Clay to get on, one more thing to say is, as Clay was explaining, a wet lease versus a dry lease. If ever you've heard about renting an aircraft, there's some similar sounding phraseology. Why do you hire it wet or dry? I think that would be a good thing whenever you talk about this, is to completely rip those apart and explain, hey, when we're talking about wet lease, it has nothing to do with hiring an aircraft with the fuel, which is what a wet rental versus a dry rental is. If you rent an R22, good luck if you can find one. But if you rent an R22 or a 172 wet, it means every hour you rent it, they'll pay for the fuel.
Right.
Whereas if you rent it dry, but this has nothing to do with that. But they use very similar phraseology. Wet lease sounds a lot like wet rental, and so whenever you try to explain this to someone, I would just squeeze those apart and say, hey, this has nothing to do with that.
I'm going to plug a Seth Lake video on this too. He does a really good job explaining wet and dry lease and just talking about exactly what you just mentioned, Jay. Here's another one of these flow charts. This one's a little bit more helicopter related because it talks about the 121 and portion of the airplane side, and it focuses on the 135 side of helicopter. So this one's just a little bit more complex, or not more complex, but just a little bit more thorough. So this is the one I'm going to share if you guys are cool with that. I'll put that in the chat.
I think when you're teaching this, I think one of the great things to do is just run through as many scenarios as you can that would hit all those exceptions and all the different pieces. Like many subjects, the more scenarios you have, the better. But I think this is what gets people uptight about, is like, well, what if the instructor, what if the DP asks me about this, that, and the other? So the more scenarios you can run, the better. And I think when you start realizing you're going down a rabbit hole, perhaps tap the brakes and go back to the idea of, well, this is what I know. And if I personally was planning on doing one of these things, because where it gets really complicated is when you're an operator. When you're a pilot, it's actually not that complicated. And so Clay spoke to earlier on, is if I'm a brand new commercial commercial pilot, and someone says to me, hey, you want to fly my helicopter? The answer is yes, every day, because that's not a problem. And I could even put posters up in the FBO about me being a helicopter pilot that can fly you a helicopter. I think that gets a bit of confusion between that and saying I can fly you in my helicopter. That's where it gets tricky. And the reality is most commercial students are not going to go do that. So I think if you can say, okay, this is what you can do as an instructor, or sorry, as a commercial operator pilot, and this is what you can do as a commercial operator with an aircraft, that's where it gets tricky. And you try to feel out as many options as you can. But at the end of the day, if you didn't know, no one's going to force you to fly in the moment without checking this stuff out. You're going to be like, hang on a second, that seems suspicious. Let me do my research. Let me maybe even call the FISDO. And I know in the past we've talked about FISDOs being non-responsive, but I think it depends obviously on the FISDO. But generally, if you're trying to if you're calling up to say, hey, look, I want to do this right. I'm not trying to skirt the regulations here. I think you might get some pretty good response. And when it's clearly a 135 operation, it clearly is.
Yeah, and always resort back to your resources and talking with other pilots. And I certainly talked about that on my check ride. That I'm going to talk about this with my network. We're going to address it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the tricky problems for people who are about to buy a helicopter or have a helicopter, and that's a whole. If you have the money to buy a helicopter, you have the money to speak to a aviation attorney or lawyer.
Yeah.
For us as commercial students who are just becoming commercial pilots, we're not in that situation. This is all very much theoretical. The reality is, someone wants to hire me as a commercial pilot, that's probably going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this stuff gets tricky. We still waiting for Clay to deliver his. Oh, I think he's got a. What's he showing here? There he goes. Nice, Clay.
It's a great question, for sure. And in here, it definitely talks about, well, what if, like, they're talking about just a flight department trap. If that's the only thing that you're doing in your business is transporting people by air, but then they're talking about, well, what if you dump another business other than air transportation into this LLC? Does that mean that it's no longer a flight department company? And they're saying that this is the clearest and most egregious cause of the larger problem, failure of the company to make sure that flights support the company's other businesses. So down here, when it's talking about what is allowed under 91.501, and that it allows guest property of the company on an aircraft operated by a company when carriage is within the scope of and incidental to the business and the company other than transportation by air, and no charge, assessment, or fee is made for the carriage in excess of the cost of owning, operating, and maintaining the, in this case, airplane, except that no charge of any kind may be made for the carriage of the guest of a company when carriage is not within the scope of or incidental to the business of the company. So I'd have to dig into it deeper. I think it's a great question.
Well, but I think that's what we were just talking about, Clay. Is that I think for a commercial student who just became a commercial pilot, that scenario is that's a legal department of a company. It's a whole
far beyond. Yeah. Nope, I think I would agree.
Clay, I put some flow charts into the chat too. Maybe at some point.
The incidental piece I still think does have to be discussed in a way, because for the private pilot regulations, you're allowed to be compensated in a way if the flight's incidental to the business. So I think there is a level of that does have to be discussed, even if it's not to that level, of owning a company and taking customers. But I think in a way, at least, to some level has to be discussed.
Agreed.
Let me look at the flowchart.
Yeah.
Which one's the better one, the top one or the bottom one?
The top one's more thorough. There's more to it. The bottom one's a little more simplified, but I think it certainly gets the point across. The bottom one a little easier to read. And I think you can almost plug any scenario into this and get an answer. I mean, obviously, you can go down rabbit holes, but.
Yeah, without going super in depth, I think it looks good, especially for the fact that, anything under Part 119, there's no operating certificate, and then anything for common or the non-common carriage all requires an operating certificate to some level. So, yeah, I think that at least delineates the biggest misconception of what's allowed and what's not.
Mm-hmm. And I think you really nailed it when you said it's 135 unless it's an exception, 119E.
Yeah.
But really, I mean, that kind of puts it in helps it fall in line.
We had a similar conversation at a instructor meeting earlier this week. Clay has been working with, he's been working on his own, but also as another fixed wing instructor, and they've both been coming to the same sort of conclusions. It's been a common misconception about some of this stuff, and I really appreciate the time play that you and Bryce have put into on this. It's because when I hold our flight school pretty high in high regard. And when Bryce got up there and he was sort of echoing a lot of the stuff that you've been saying, there was a lot of wide eyes, which means, and I don't know about it, I can't speak for everyone else, but I think there was a lot of misconceptions specifically about private carriage and what that really means. I really appreciate all the time that you and Bryce have put in, and especially with what you've done with this presentation.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty eye-opening too. Again, I just think that AC 120 has just been the worst thing. I think that's just been the crux of what everyone teaches, is just that one document.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what because it's like when you go into commercial operations, it's like every time it's taught, the first thing they say is, well, let's go talk about common carriage.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's particularly the first piece to it all. Of if it's that, I think there's a lot of other pieces in there, because really the common carriage thing to me only falls for kind of two pieces. One, on whether or not you're allowed to do the expense sharing, because if it's common carriage, you can't. And then the other piece is when you're determining on the operating certificate, whether or not your privileges are for common carriage or private carriage. But beyond that, you can't overlay that onto all the 119 stuff. I actually saw that on one of the letter of interpretations of someone asking, well, can I hold out if I'm doing one of these Part 119 exceptions? And you absolutely can. Otherwise, you're probably never going to get a job.
I think this is one of these times where the FAA's advisory circulars are actually making it worse.
Yeah.
AC 120, whatever it is become more of a confusing factor than perhaps if it wasn't there.
Yeah.
Whoever's in charge of updating that has probably died or retired and not told anyone. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't talk too much shit. I haven't updated the maneuver guide in 5 years, so I understand.
Yeah, I don't know if he's still alive, but if the Grissom guy or the guy from the Gorman versus NTSB, if he was still alive, I think he would have been a great one to have on the call to talk about the differences between the two.
To get his opinion. It's funny, though, the FAA said that doesn't even really hold water, that it's just an advice, and that classic.
Yeah, and I think that court case is such a valuable piece, because all the other stuff, it's recommendations or here's what you should or shouldn't do, but that's one that's been tried and prosecuted on rather than all the others. So I think that one definitely carries a lot of weight for what's true and what's not.
You're muted, Cole. We can't hear you. Cole, are you talking? Can't hear you, buddy.
All right. Cole, you talking?
I think he was trying. Okay. But Tio, you're up, bud.
In the meantime, I think what really confused me most while I was digging into all of this was, private carriage needing an operational certificate and then just being hired as a commercial pilot by someone that has operational control. And then going back to that AC 120, 12 something, And how it says, oh, if you do like 1 to 3, it's private carriage, still with an operational certificate.
Yeah.
If you do more than 18, it's common carriage. But that doesn't apply to you flying as just a commercial pilot by someone that has his own aircraft, like his or her own aircraft, and how you can fly essentially however many times you want to, getting paid if you're being hired by someone that provides the aircraft and has operational control, right?
Yes,
That
exactly.
was super
Yeah.
confusing all the
There's
time.
a guy that I can't remember who says it. I think he's the guy that runs VSL Aviation on Instagram. But he says you can either pimp the pilot, you can pimp the plane, but you can't pimp both. Because as soon as you do both, now you're a commercial operator. So I can offer up my services, I can offer up my plane or my aircraft, but I can't do both at the same time. Because as soon as I
Yeah.
do commercial operator, then unless I'm within a 119 exception.
That should be the new FAA AC. That should just be the title of it. You can pimp
Yep.
one or the other. Get with the times, FAA. Come on.
I assure you that'll get some viewers.
I believe it would. Teach that in flight schools all over the country. So does Leading Edge have a Part 121 certificate? No.
No, that's a 135.
135.
As Clay was sort of, I think actually he was probably showing our certificate where he blanked stuff out. It's an inter certificate, so we can. Actually, I'm not using the right word. What's the word? It's a not an operator certificate. It's a
Air carrier certificate.
air carrier certificate. Thank you. For common carriage.
Yep.
I will say, I when I worked for Papillon, I'm pretty sure they had a 121 certificate as a helicopter operator. And the reason, and we'll see if anyone corrects this when you post this on YouTube, but I'm pretty sure the reason was that I think the airplane and the helicopter operations were under the same umbrella certificate. And we were scheduled to run a helicopter from Boulder City in Vegas out to the canyon every single day, and that counted as a scheduled air carrier.
Mm.
And the benefit was all of our employees could get
No, the reverse one?
on airlines as what do you call them, non-revenue. So all our instructors were able to not jump seat in the cockpit, but jump seat in the back, and could get back and forth to Vegas for their whatever schedule they had.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I misspoke too. Obviously, I mean, a 121 is for commercial airliners primarily, right? And then Papillon might have fallen into that category. But what category does it fall under? If you're for typical for typical flight schools that also run tours, that
Depends.
I mean,
you
that's still
you can do a bunch of stuff under Part 91 and that
Yeah.
exception. So
Yeah.
I'm sure there's plenty of flight schools that do
right.
Part 119 exception, and we do too, actually.
Yeah.
So we hire our instructors that hire we put them into the tour program, and they go do these tours within 25 miles,
Right.
and they can fly up over the mountains and stuff like that. And they they have to go into a separate drug and alcohol program and all those things that Clay spoke about.
Right.
But they're not 135 operators. So as soon as we have to exceed that limitation in miles, or they have to land,
Then you're
those
135.
instructors do that. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Cole, did you have something to say? Thought I saw you chatting there.
It's gone.
Yeah, audio's been a little iffy tonight. Oh, there he goes. We'll give him a minute to come back. Yeah, that was super helpful. Anybody have any other?
Can you hear me
comments?
now?
There he is. He's back. What you got, brother?
Okay. So just to go with that. That I did have that question previously when I was training about 121, if there were any 121s. My DPE at the time, he flies offshore oil, and he said they weren't even a 121, and he didn't think that there was any helicopter 121s, just because, I mean, he felt like that was the closest thing that would be scheduled out of anything, because they were flying this same route the same time every day. But apparently, some whatever reason, that isn't a 121. What I'm doing right now with the school that I'm at is, it just depends, I think, with what you're saying about the can you do it all under 91? And I think it would just fall under the distance requirement for the tours.
25 miles.
Yeah.
And then returning to the same place.
Right.
Hey, Cole,
Just real quick though. Yeah.
Just to answer your question, so I flew in the Gulf as well, and they did not do the scheduled stuff. So I could not fly. Wish I could. I could not fly from Oregon to Louisiana as what they call an airline pilot on jump seat for the company I work for. It's one of the biggest ones in the Gulf, and I think it's more to do with the fact that Papillon had these scheduled airplane flights, and so it was easy for them to put the helicopter crew in, and then we could all benefit from that as far as jump seating in the back.
Right.
But unfortunately, as far as I know, everyone who's operating out of the Gulf as a helicopter, you're paying out, for the most part, you're paying out of pocket, and you're not getting jump seat privileges.
Right.
Yeah.
Jay, you had ATP for... go ahead, Cole.
No, you're good. I was going to move on to something else, so keep going.
Well, Jay, you have ATP for both fixed wing and helicopter, right?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And the
That
helicopter...
was relevant to getting jump seat. The jump seat, even before I got that, it was one of the benefits to working for Papillon, is because they had a 121 operation. You became part of I can't remember what the thing's called. It's like a known crew member, or I can't remember what the acronym probably is, but it allowed you
KCM.
Yeah. So you you'd have to be in uniform, and you'd turn up at the airport, and you would put on standby. You didn't have privileges to get in the cockpit, but you had the privileges to literally sit for free on the aircraft.
Fly standby.
Didn't matter who operated it, to get yourself to the base. And on top of that, this program where you could travel either on your off day, or you and your family could go somewhere either at a huge discount or free. So it was a nice benefit.
That is nice.
Yeah. I used to work for Breeze, and the airline employees, they also get that benefit as well. No, what I was going to ask, my other question with that was, maybe I just want to confirm whether, because this was the scenario that did come up a few times at a flight school I was at, where you talked about that, Clay, you talked about that fire lookout tower that needed work, and so they were taking cargo to there. But then I guess the question would be, is cargo only, because I know there's that, I forget if it's an AC or whatever, but the definition of cargo. But basically, if they were bringing only their tools and were working on it, and then they were coming back and it was within the 25 miles, could it then still count for that? And I think the thing that we came up with that it could, and obviously there's other, I'm sure I'm leaving out certain details, but as long as nothing was left there, and as long as it was point A to point B, and it was going to there and dropping it off. And I think it also probably had to be within that 25-mile radius, then it still could be operated under that 91.
So I don't think the 25-mile, let me go down to...
Applies to that.
Right.
Yeah.
I need this, so thanks.
Because under number 4, yeah, it doesn't list anything specific to the 25 miles, just that rotorcraft operations and direction repair work. So I don't think the 25 pertains to that in any way. And then, so I guess one of the other questions is, are there personal tools considered, I guess, cargo for the transportation? But to me, it's kind of the same thing as if you're doing a survey, you have to have the camera. So you can't consider the camera as cargo because it's required for the work that you're doing. So, yeah, that's a pretty tricky one. I'd love to see if I
But
can
could you
find a lot.
consider it baggage then at that point? If it's personal to the passenger, it's not getting left there. Could you then just consider it baggage? I think it could be.
To me, yeah, I would say so. Because again, I think it's a required tool for the operation. It's not, something that we're using to build the site. So I think if it's a personal tool that you're taking there and bringing back, I think that'd be different than if you left it there or if it was a part of the structure itself.
All right.
Then with that same scenario, then I typically ask students, well, what about if we had a long line and we, did a sling load to take it there, prompting the additional Part 133 requirement for if you're going to do an external load. So I think pretty much anything within this exception is kind of a great scenario builder for all the different additional parts. And one of the ones that I typically ask kind of gets into the ag work side. Let me pull up that scenario.
You pull up the scenario, I'll pull up the flow chart.
So in this scenario, a farmer reaches out to you and says that he bought an R44 spray system and needs 1,200 acres of corn sprayed with insecticide. Can you use his spray system in your R44 under Part 91 to do that?
Flowchart doesn't help much with that one.
Ooh, I think that's Part 137.
Yeah, 137. Now, what if, let's say he, instead of the corn, let's say that instead it was his wife's sunflowers and she just needed water sprayed on them. Would that be permissible under Part 91?
Just water?
Yeah, just water.
What's the definition in the FARs of ag ops?
So there's an AC for Part 137. Let's see if I can pull it up. But essentially, I believe within here, it'll talk about how if it's, and I'm paraphrasing this, but essentially if it's not something that can either kill or affect the crop itself, then you wouldn't need a Part 137 for that. It's not like an environmental fluid, I guess you could say. Let me see if I can find it.
So going along that then, of not dumping anything or not doing anything, is there situations that you could do a larger operation of cherry drying without needing a certificate?
We know a cherry dryer.
Yeah, cherry dry, but I think cherry drying would be perfectly allowed there within the...
Just under 91?
Yeah, aerial work operations under crop dusting, seeding, spraying, and bird chasing. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be permissible under just Part 91.
Jay, what are you guys running? 137? No. It says
91.
Engaging in activities directly affecting horticulture, crop production, or forest preservation. But
well, couldn't you say that for cherries? Couldn't you say that it directly affects crop production?
Right.
I mean, because without it, it would affect their yield, right? That's the whole point of hiring.
In this AC, it talks about some exemptions to Part 137. And it has an exemption for Part 133, and it talks about if an operator holds a Part 133 certificate, they may conduct an agricultural aircraft operation that involves only dispensing water with a spreader additive on the forest fires by external load means without having to meet Part 137 requirements.
So, well, first off, are you looking at another one of your lessons, or is it a specific AC or
This
something?
AC 137-1 Bravo.
So then I've got another thing that I've then thought of. If you are hired by someone who is a millionaire who was in the Palisades or something like that with the fires going on prior to the fires being close by to there. So you are not within the area of the fires. However, the person contacted you to employ you to drop some water on around their property or around their house prior to the fire getting close to there because they wanted to be safe. And so they wanted to wet, their house or structure or whatever. Would that fall under firefighting ops?
Would that fall? So firefighting is on there, but how are they dispensing the water? Because if they're using a Bambi bucket, then you're an external load, and then you would need a Part 133.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oh, if it's just water, you wouldn't need a 137, but you would just need the 133 in order to have that external load.
What if it was in a sprayer, like you said?
If it's in that's a great question. I don't think so.
New small
I
business.
think if my house is about to burn, I think the FAA might turn a blind eye to me putting a hose pipe out the helicopter.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Mhm.
So that's a little business we could start up there, Cole. Good thinking. We'll pre-treat houses as the fires come
Yeah.
through.
I mean, it's a lot safer than some guy stand behind to try and keep it with a hose. Get out of there real quick if you something goes south.
Yeah. I think either you have to have the 137 or you have to have the 133. I don't know if you could do it without either one. Because under the 133 or under the 137, it talks about the 133 exceptions. So you can dispense water if you have a 133. And then if you're under 137, then you don't have to have that if you're So yeah, I think you'd have to have one or the other. But it's a great question.
There's
to add
an
to my list
exception
of
under
things to
119.1e that seeing, spraying, or crop dusting.
Yeah, but the question is whether or not the spray system is considered an external load. I think is where we're starting to get into that piece.
Got it. There's there is one exception also for what is it, like emergency assistance, something along those lines, under 119.1. Isn't there like an exception for like if there's like hurricane assistance, if you have an operation you can go drop off supplies and fall under that exemption, right? It's ringing a bell. Does that ring a bell with anybody else? I know that we talked about that at some point. Huh.
It sounds familiar, but it's
Doesn't it?
just a little bit.
I don't see it anywhere in my notes, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, I don't see it either. But I think for the spray system, it would be a Class A external load. So you would have to have a 133. Then if you have a 133, then you get the 137 exemption if you're only spraying water. So I think we had this same discussion before of the spray system itself would be the Class A load because it cannot move freely and you can't jettison it. But the water within the spray system or the chemical or whatever it is, that would then become a Class B load because you could jettison it. So there are two separate things.
Can I ask a different question?
Ask away.
So this one is about exception. Territories with all those limitations of 25 miles and all the other ones. This comes from a question I got. My instructor mentioned something about a company maybe just giving cameras to people. So instead of labeling as, oh, this is a commercial air tour, I'm going to label it as this is an aerial photography. That's going around the law of the 25 miles and all the other things. Did someone hear anything about that, or was my instructor just, I don't know, okay, sorry.
I couldn't really hear that one. Did you catch the question?
I was a little broken up, Dio.
You're really Wi-Fi. You might need to turn off your Bluetooth. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah, buddy.
Oh wait, no, I cannot hear anyone.
Now you can't hear us?
Oh wait, I can, just very low. Right, so the question is, if I have a commercial air tour set up, right? But I wanted to go more than those 25 statute miles. Can I rephrase it as I'm giving these people cameras and now it's a photography flight?
It is
I'd say no.
It's the age-old one that I think everyone always
Yeah.
always tries to get around the regulation by. If I just give them, even with their phone has a camera, does that qualify as aerial photography? And I think this one just comes down to, yeah, you'd probably get away with it the first time, and if someone, an FAA inspector asks, you could definitely tell them this is aerial photography. I think if it happens again and again, then I think it's going to be giving the impression that you're conducting, air transportation beyond what's
Under the-
permissible. So
Under the guise of photo flights or what have you. There's a good video out there. I gotta find it where the FAA actually discusses this on the FAA safety site. So if I find it, I'm gonna put it on the chat or guess.
I think cover your own ass. I would get someone to sign some sort of paperwork to say, this is not a tour. I have contracted this pilot to take photographs, to survey this set. And then, it's on, you've done everything you can. If you're doing that, as Jay said, if you're doing that every other day, if FISDO is probably going to say, come on, man. Yeah.
So there's 119.57, obtaining a deviation authority to perform emergency operations. I think maybe that's what I was referring to.
Well, I was wondering, are you talking about what's the exemption specifically? Are you saying exempted from you're able to do certain work and get around regulations, or are you saying you're exempted from getting paid?
To get around regulations and still fly under Part 91.
Gotcha.
But it will require a little bit more reading, and because I have some friends in North Carolina that were flying hurricane relief, and they were flying supplies and for critical life support for people who were unable to to leave. They were in flooded zones. They were picking people up off roofs, dropping off supplies in some of these areas where people were trapped. And my impression was they were doing that under some sort of exemption.
So would that exemption also apply not just transporting cargo like food and supplies, but also not even saying like pulling somebody off the roof, but instead taking someone into the area and dropping them off? Would that also apply?
I think so. Those conditions necessitate the transport of persons or supplies for the protection of life and property.
Okay. Yeah, that would definitely.
Yeah.
For that. Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I'll highlight that.
Yeah. You just have to notify the FSDO 24 hours after the operation's complete. I think there's more to it, of course, but that's the gist that I. Anything else, you guys? Any other questions? Anything else to add to this? Real thorough investigation here. That was great.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
No question per se. First of all, Clay, outstanding job.
Yeah.
Love the presentation. But just the announcement, even though it's not official yet, but I guess we got Pete Gillies to sign up for June 27th. He's going to do his cyclic back presentation. So I just got to process it through FAA safety, and then we can start spreading the word. If anybody does have access to Zoom Workplace or something like that, where we could stay on and not get knocked off like last time on Teams, or something that's paid, if somebody could build that presentation. What is it?
Why can't you use this platform if you ask attendants at the end of the presentation to sign up? If you,
I think this is limited to, when they say, John, about an hour or so.
Yeah.
If it will get knocked. I mean, for us, I guess it works, and then a lot of people aren't familiar with Discord, so it's a little bit tricky for the older folks. Like it was hard to get them to agree, but he said, I'm going to have an assistant, so I'm sure they'll know how to do Teams or Zoom. I'm not sure if they'll know how to do Discord. So, but I'm trying to get, I mean, if need be, we can just have him for an hour, but
Yeah.
I'd love to have the option if he's willing to hang on a little bit longer, to stay on there. So, but
maybe what we can do is, I think we lost a bunch of people last time who didn't realize they could just refresh in 5 minutes. So I think perhaps as we get close to the end, if we do it through those other platforms, you just say, hey, we're going to go off in a few seconds. If that happens, just keep refreshing. We're coming back. I think we lost I didn't realize that how it worked either. You could just keep refreshing, but that works, right?
Yeah. It doesn't hurt. I
might have a way. If you guys need, I might have a couple. I have Google Workspaces, so Google Meet. I don't have Zoom, but I think I probably would
tried
have
that. I think we tried
too.
that with John. Remember the first ones were on Google Meet, and it kept knocking us off.
Yeah, and GoToMeet sounds like it's another one that the EAA and AOPA use. They seem to work well.
GoToMeeting, yeah.
Yep. So
is that a paid one, or?
I think
GoToMeeting is paid. Yeah.
And then it's otherwise limited to an hour, right?
Yeah,
and I think the only way beyond that is just to have a Zoom account. Now, I'm pretty sure you can do a 30-day trial of Zoom, and I don't think it's that expensive.
Yeah. The next thing too, I could beg one of the FPMs. Like, I know Melanie is pretty involved with it. I could maybe write her an email, and if she could be on there, because we could use Zoom Government, but one of them has to host it. I can't just host it.
Well, you're doing a great job, Jay. I mean, I would even wouldn't mind contributing. You sign up for free, get the 30-day trial. Let's knock this one out, and then just see what it costs from there, and we can just reassess. But for an immediate solution, let's just do the sign up for free.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
But I'll definitely push through the presentation tomorrow.
Yeah.
And the hard part was just getting them signed
Yeah.
on, because as I wrote you this morning and desperately, hey, you might have to write him because I think he's going to pull out.
Right.
But then I saw this morning, he's like, okay, Jay, I'm going to have an assistant. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm sure they could figure out
Yeah.
Microsoft Teams or Zoom. So I was like, that's great. That's,
doing a great job
so
getting that going for sure.
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, we'll get a flyer going. We'll get that one promoted as well. That's great. Well, another super productive meeting, you guys. Anything else anybody wants to?
Yeah, just real quick. So I
Yeah.
mentioned a ton of different LOIs, ACs. So this is the website that I've made, which has a couple hundred resources in it. It's all free stuff.
You made this.
And so all of the ACs, LOIs, and everything I'm going to get added in here. So you can go to resources, flight training. It'll give you a bunch of different options.
Wow.
And for this one, it'll be under regulations. And right now, there's just the standard links to, LOI search and things. But all the ones that I mentioned, I'm going to get added in here. So there will be an exhaustive list of everything that we talked about. And there's numerous other resources all throughout here for flight training stuff. Tons of stuff that Jay's put out. And it's all in here. So if there's any other additional resources that you guys find beneficial, feel free to send those over to me, and I can include all of them in here. It's a pretty, it's a pretty growing list of things, and even the R22 pre-flight guide that I've got for free, it's all in here too, which is like 112 pages of pre-flight information.
Wow,
So
that's very thorough.
But yeah, everything should be in there eventually.
You set a high standard there, brother. You got to build in an AI client to that thing.
No, all by hand.
Any clone.
Clay, Clay, is this you running the website?
Yeah, the website, and then there's an Instagram and Facebook.
Nice.
And I post pretty consistently, 4 to 5 times a week on there. And so I'll put a bunch of accidents on there. And then typically what I do is when I post an accident, the next day, the resource is the direct, resource that would work for that accident. So if it was an accident about CFIT, the next day's resource is about, how to prevent CFIT. I do a bunch of aviation trivia stuff on there too. And so, yeah, feel free to give it a look, but it's just a ton of resources and ones that I find is reputable. The longer social media goes on, I see a lot of random, AI sites that are making handouts and things. And so most of the stuff on there is all from direct either FA sources or something that's, legitimate.
I put your link in the chat. It's in the chat.
I have this bookmarked. I must have been here before. This is an outstanding resource. Well done, man. Very thorough. All right, you guys. Great stuff. Thank you, Clay.
Yeah.
Thrilled to have you. Great presentation. Well, that wraps up Helicopter Pilot Study Group number 20. We'll sign up for 21 next week. If you guys have any ideas, throw it in the chat. Otherwise, I will, or throw it in the Max Performance channel. Otherwise, I will come up with something and go from there. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
See
Thanks,
ya.
everyone.
Thanks.